Welcome back. I'm Adrien Harewood. As we've been reporting, the coronavirus outbreak is causing major disruptions to life as we know it. Schools are closing. Major sporting and cultural events are being postponed or cancelled. It's an unsettling time. On the work front, the virulence of the virus is causing employers and employees to consider their rights and obligations to each other. Workers, whether permanent, temporary, or casual, are eager to preserve their livelihood while protecting their health. Employers are keen to ensure the integrity of their businesses and organizations. Alex Lucifero is an Ottawa employment lawyer, and I spoke with him earlier today about the challenges presented by the pandemic to the workplace. Here's our conversation. Alex Lucifero, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, pleasure to be here.
We know that both the Prime Minister and his wife Sophie Trudeau are in self-isolation. If an employee is asked by his or her employer to go into self-isolation, what rights does the employee have?
Well, the gist of it, Adrien, is that an employer does have an obligation on its part to protect its employees and keep its employees healthy and safe in the work environment. And so if there is evidence, so if that employee has traveled from an affected country, if that employee is showing very recent signs of coronavirus symptoms, fever, et cetera, that employer can very well ask that employee and indeed force that employee to stay home. The question becomes then whether that employer has to pay that employee. The employer doesn't, again, interestingly enough, have the obligation to pay that employee, but hopefully for those employees there are other avenues of income available, employment insurance, sick days, etc.
Can an employee refuse to self-isolate?
Good question. I mean, we're in the realm of reasonableness here. We have to follow the science, and so if an employee is, insisting on attending work, and for example, that employee does have symptoms of coronavirus or did come from an affected area, then it would be right for that employer to ask that employee to stay home. Alternatively, on the other side of the spectrum, if the employee reasonably fears that they may be kind of come in contact in the workplace with coronavirus. So, for example, we saw the company Sienna here in Ottawa send all of its employees home, working from home. If those employees feel like there is an actual fear in the workplace of being infected or testing positive for the virus, they would be able to stay home and kind of refuse, for example, an employer's demands.
So they can refuse an assignment.
They can potentially, if the fears are reasonable. I mean, we don't want to foster here paranoia. We don't want to, our employees to kind of go into a frenzy or employers to go into a frenzy. Again, reason should prevail. The science, in fact, should prevail. And this is one of those times in the employment law context where employers and employees should be working together to come up with a reasonable solution to these kinds of problems. And those solutions exist.
When it comes to maintaining a safe workplace, what kind of obligation does the employer have?
Well, the employer is to, as much as possible, their obligations are to keep that in a case like this, the workplace clean, the workplace let's say disease or infectious disease free. They can only do so much effectively, and so, for example, let's use the example of Sienna again. They obviously discovered that one of their employees had traveled to an affected area and contracted the virus, and rightfully so. The company ordered all of its employees, who may have well come in contact with that person if they worked in the office environment, ordered them to stay home and work from home. That's certainly an obligation. Other, let's say basic obligations are reminding your employees about hygiene and cleanliness. Wash your hands when you use the washroom. Wash your hands when you come in and outside of the office area. Don't shake hands, for example. Those kind of basic pieces of advice that we should all be giving each other certainly are part of the obligations of an employer to do that.
Can a company like Sienna force an employee to refrain from personal travel, certain kinds of personal travel?
Very good question. No, they can't. An employer cannot reach into an employee's personal life and dictate what they can and cannot do. But then again, if that employee so chooses to travel for personal reasons and perhaps to an affected area, there are very few unaffected areas, I think, left at this point, then an employer, again, does have the obligation to protect its other employees, and so would have to require that employee to either self-isolate or take any other action that they deem necessary.
If you are a precarious or casual worker, you have no sick leave, you have no family leave, and you're forced to self-isolate, what kind of protections do you have? What are the obligations of the employer
Yeah.
to precarious workers?
That's a great question, Adrien, and a very difficult situation for some of those employees without sick days, for example. So what the Canadian government has done most recently is that they have waived the what we call the waiver period or the freeze period for employment insurance. And so that person may be able to apply for what are called employment insurance sickness benefits. That would start right away. It's obviously not an employee's full income. It's effectively employment insurance, but that is a revenue stream and an area of income that could perhaps hold them over until they're ready to go back to work.
The employer doesn't have to compensate them. It's not obliged to compensate them. As a
Not
casual
in the
worker.
case of an actual medical leave of absence, no. Another example would be short-term disability benefits. That's another option for an employee who's medically unable to work. Again, there is a certain period there where you wouldn't receive those benefits, but if you are off of work for a prolonged period of time, you may very well qualify for short-term disability benefits if you have that coverage through your employer.
We know that there are going to be a lot of workers who are going to feel a lot of anxiety and they're feeling a lot of mental pressure. What kind of obligation does the employer have to ensure that the mental health of their employees remains strong?
That's tough. I mean, that's probably an area, Adrien, where the law will not necessarily intervene in most cases, only in the most egregious of cases. And so, you know, the law will protect an employee where an employer is, you know, harassing the employee or where there is a poisoned work environment. Those are areas where the law will definitely come in and protect. But in situations where, let's say, you know, employees are generally just anxious or kind of struggling to cope with some of these changes that are being implemented as a result of the coronavirus, I think it's going to be up to, as I mentioned before, you know, good management skills, good people skills, consensus, communication, all of those softer factors, what I would call, you know, non-legal factors, are going to be crucial because, again, in cases like that, the law will intervene very little. The law is quite robust when it comes to termination of employment and areas like that, but when it comes to, you know, mental health in the workplace, the first line of defense has to be person to person. Let's treat each other well and let's make sure that we're acting reasonably and responsibly.
Alex Lucifero, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure, Adrien.
That was my conversation with Alex Lucifero. And Lucy there, you know, Alex really emphasizing the importance of communication between the employee and the employer and the fact that they need to work together and be reasonable.